said, tonight's our town hall covering health impacts. She's with the Gender and Radiation Impact Project, and we have Dr. Robert Dodge with Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, whom some of you may have known for his work on this site many, many years. Next slide. Parents Against the Santa Susana Field Lab acknowledges the original inhabitants of the land that the Santa Susana Field Lab encompasses. The 2,850 acres of land that constitute SSFL have been utilized by the Ventureño Chumash, the Tongva, and the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians indigenous communities for time immemorial. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants and seek meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. We're going to start with what you all now know and love as the site overview. The Santa Susana Field Lab was formerly known as Rocketdyne, established in the late 1940s for rocket testing. And in 1949, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, was looking for a remote lab space for work that was too dangerous to be done in populated areas, nuclear work. The current SSFL site ranked 5th out of 6 for meteorological safety criteria. Nonetheless, it was still chosen due to the convenient drive time to UCLA and USC. This is a map of the Santa Susana Field Lab as broken up by the individual land parcels and the responsible parties that control them. So the dark orange is the northern buffer zone in the area 4 where the nuclear work was done. Those 2 parcels are under the Department of Energy's responsibility. The middle orange is area 1, the little parcel at top, and area 2, those are both NASA properties. And the rest, the majority of the site, area 1, area 3, and the southern buffer zone are the responsibility of the Boeing company. The location of the site is that little red funny shape in the middle. Over 700,000 people live within 10 miles of the Santa Susana Field Lab, even though you can't see it because it's on a plateau up in the hills between LA County and Ventura County. It is indeed surrounded by many populated municipalities. Here is a nice view where you can see the city you can see in front is Simi Valley. In between the lab and Simi is the Brandeis Bardeen camp, and you can see the various communities surrounding the lab on all sides. SSFL was a rocket engine testing site with over 30,000 rocket engine tests conducted. Almost 800,000 gallons of trichloroethylene, TCE, was lost into the soil. And for 500,000 gallons of TCE remain in a toxic plume under the site. These photographs never fail to make an impact on me. So instead of doing the right thing and transporting their toxic hazardous waste appropriately, which would have cost more money, they took barrels and dumped them into pits on site. Dozens a month were dumped, and at times they would shoot rifles at them so that they would combust. And that's the image on the top left, where you can see the barrels being shot at by a rifleman and the toxicity being blown into the atmosphere. This is a map of area 4. This is where the nuclear work was done at the Santa Susana Field Lab. There were 10 nuclear reactors, 4 of which had major accidents. One of those was the infamous sodium reactor experiment that had the location of the partial meltdown. There were also plutonium and uranium fuel facilities. Plutonium, which Dr. Dodge will be speaking about shortly, one of the most hazardous, toxic substances known to man. Area 4 was a site of explosions, some intentional, some not intentional, spills, fires, leaks, and radioactive accidents. here are the images of the sodium reactor experiment. You can see that the reactor back then was not enclosed in a containment structure. So if there was an accident, which there was with the SRE reactor, in which 13 of the 43 fuel elements overheated and failed, instead of there being a containment structure, essentially the garage door was opened, and that contamination was vented to the surrounding areas. So while DTSC will say that radioactivity, chemical contamination does not get off site, after the Woolsey fire, there was an independent study done by Fairwinds Energy Education, with which Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab was a part of, and we can see that indeed radioactivity did get off site in particles of soil and dust. And in fact, the hottest sample collected was at the furthest extent of our boundary area, which was in Newbury Park. From that same time, while DTSC assured folks in the surrounding areas that we were not at risk, that the public was safe, there was not contamination coming off site, the NPDS, the stormwater permit in the 2 following quarters showed 57 exceedances of toxic chemical constituents. And to connect it further all the way to the people in the surrounding areas, the EPA in 2007 had stated that the 2 wells used by the Golden State Water Company could be possibly at some point contaminated by SSFL groundwater. So we see what happened on site. We see that it has migrated off site, and we see that the EPA is acknowledging that at least some of Simi Valley could be at risk of ingesting that contamination. And we will hand this over to Dr. Dodge from Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So can you hear me okay? Great. So, all right. So yes, and our organization has been involved with this pretty much since it was first discovered that the accident occurred. We've been working with Dan Hirsch for several decades now. So I'm pleased to be here. Thank you. So next slide there. So we've heard about the activities, the experiments, and the accidents that have occurred on site. The accidents and development and just activities on site have left the area as one of the probably most contaminated sites in the country. And so it's contaminated not only with radioactive radionuclides that are of concern, but also with hundreds of chemicals. So here again, we list some of the radionuclides that are known to be existent with the runoff from the lab. The issue with these molecules or these radionuclides, the body will take these in and perceive them as life-giving compounds, chemicals, and it then incorporates them into areas of our bodies. One, again, strontium-90, for example, which is where Physicians for Social Responsibility gained some of its early fame, came from strontium-90 is not a naturally occurring radioisotope. It occurs only from nuclear explosions, nuclear reactions. And to the body, it looks like calcium. And that's important because when the body ingests the strontium-90, it's deposited where calcium would go. So in children, babies in particular, it's deposited in babies' teeth, in adults in bone, et cetera, where it then can exist for decades thereafter, causing an increased potential for cancer. And so you can read down the list here, but several of them: iodine, very involved, very contaminating to the thyroid gland; plutonium, one of the deadliest compounds on the planet. Even a fraction of a millionth of an ounce or gram can basically cause absolute 100% cancer risk. So next slide. So the issue is, some of the things we've been dealing with over the years, people say, oh, the events at the Susana Field Lab happened so many years ago, et cetera. But the problem is so many of these compounds exist and dangerous for years and years and hundreds of years thereafter. The radionuclides, for example, most of us are familiar with radioactive half-lives, okay? That's the time where a radioactive compound basically breaks down to half of its initial strength, if you will. So for strontium 90, for example, these three are very common on the site. Strontium 90, the half-life is 28 years, cesium 137, plutonium 239, again, probably the deadliest subtopic on the planet, 24,000 years. But that's only part of the story, because the reality is the hazardous life is 20 half-lives. That's why when you say, well, this happened 50 years ago, why are we worried about it? Well, the hazardous life is 20 half-lives. So if we look at that for strontium 90 and cesium, both those, it puts them about 550 years, okay? And for plutonium, it's 500,000 years where this is potentially dangerous, okay? So these are incredibly dangerous, incredibly toxic elements. So next slide. So traditionally, we have used what's called the reference man to identify and identify radiation protection and guidelines. The reference man is ostensibly a 20 to 30-year-old Caucasian male. Well, that's how we've traditionally used this. And Mary's going to talk more, but obviously women and children are far more vulnerable than the reference man to so many of these impacts and things. And so that's where it's now moving away from and saying, no, we can't use that 20 to 30-year-old Caucasian male to establish all guidelines and the like. So again, very important topic. Next slide. So one of the areas, again, why we're also concerned, again, people say, oh, it's been so long ago, et cetera. And one of our efforts that we've been pushing is to clean the site up to background. In 2006, one of the agencies of the National Academy of Sciences came out with what's called the Beer 7 report. That stands for the biologic effect of ionizing radiation. This was their 7th report. And this is where they actually identified what's called the linear no threshold concept. That linear no threshold says basically there is no safe level of radioactive exposure. Every level, even background level, puts you at some increased risk of cancer. Well, but when then the contamination exists above background, obviously the risk increases. So that's why we're demanding this site must be cleaned up to background. We can't reduce it less than background, but to leave say, well, it's only 5 times background, it's only 10 times background is crazy. Okay, next slide. And this also, that same Beer 7 report also brought out and identified the issues where exposure, both, again, in terms of age and gender brought in. So what happens if you look from the left-hand side of the slide, the pink in the highest risk are young infant females, okay? And again, across the entire spectrum, women are at greater risk than men for the risks and the cancers caused by radionuclide exposures. So again, and young people you see there, again, under 20, under 30, but then as we move up to 40, it starts to flatten out and drop off into 70 and 88 decades. Next slide. So here comes from Cindy Falkers, who is going to be with with us potentially. But the highlight here is, therefore, in any area where we know radiation exposure was possible or likely, and there are increases in diseases of various types, it's not up to us to prove that it was the radiation. They need to show us that it wasn't. Okay, we don't have the burden of proof to show to demand that yes, it was caused by the site. Next slide. I spoke of, again, toxic chemicals, and effectively there are over 300 toxic chemicals that have been derived both in the soil, the groundwater, and the surface water at the site. And we know from previous lectures, when it rains or when the fires occur, these chemicals do not remain on site. They migrate off site, okay? It is really a who's who of toxic chemicals, many of which are some people are familiar with what we call forever chemicals, because when they basically are there forever, they don't degrade, et cetera. So they must be removed physically. Next slide. And this has, again, kind of a list of some of the more important ones. The TCEs, these are agents that were used to clean up after the rocket engine blast, et cetera, clean the rocket engines, et cetera. Again, they cause, they're both cancer causing, they cause major issues to the liver and the kidneys. Again, they impair fetal development, talking about young infants and preborn. Perchlorate also acts like iodine, so it blocks iodine absorption into the thyroid, is also associated with learning disabilities in babies and young children, low thyroid issues, developmental issues, etc. Dioxins are chemical, again, carcinogens. They cause developmental agent problems, etc., immune problems, and endocrine problems. PCBs, again, major cancer causer, in fact, involving the liver, the endocrine system, again. And finally, lead. And lead, you know, as I still do pediatrics, and we are so concerned in our inner cities about lead exposure from old paint, in old areas, particularly in our large, older cities in the country. And so for those of us who see children within the Medi-Cal population, we have to each year screen the children for lead exposure, et cetera. Bottom line, there is no safe level of lead exposure. Any level of lead puts you at an increased risk also of primarily neurotoxic, which means developmental brain problems, et cetera. And also it causes what we call blood dyscrasias, can cause some major issues with the development of blood cells and the like. So, all right, next slide. So again, how has it impacted our communities? Well, we know from workers who worked on site, there were 6 to 8 times greater, cancer risk, et cetera, than atomic bomb survivors. Okay, this was a study put forth by the Environmental Protection Agency in 2007. Next slide. Again, for the period 1988 to 95, we identified this is a study, again, funded by the Department of Toxic Substance Control. And it shows the incidence of cancer was 60% greater among residents living within a 2-mile radius of the site than those living greater than 5 miles away. And these cancers were what we call incident cancers. They're cancers that are associated with the exposure to these very specific radionuclides on this site. Next slide. So, and again, here's one that just says if an individual, this is a study also done by Boeing, and I'm sorry, not by Boeing, but the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles, and it showed that if individuals were to live on site in certain areas, 9 out of 10 individuals living on the site in those contaminated areas would get cancer over their lifetime. And this just goes, again, Melissa, who's been such a face to this effort for so many years now as well, shows, again, where we identified the pediatric cancer clusters just from meeting other parents at Children's Hospital. Hey, you live down the street. Hey, you live around the corner, or whatever, and things. So again, these cancer cluster area, which again is certainly concerning for the closeness to those sites. Next slide. Again, and these are families and individuals involved, our neighbors, our friends. Next slide. And this basically, it's also been known that there is a breast cancer cluster in the area around Simi Valley, down in Thousand Oaks, et cetera. And so these things just start to raise the question. We can't prove it, but again, these are concerns because of those clusters and things that happen to be right next to the site. Next slide. And this again, and one more, again, this comes back to, again, sort of the level of exposure that is without increased cancer risk. So basically ionized radiation has the potential to damage DNA, which can result in uncontrolled and abnormal cell division, which ultimately can result in cancer. Next. And this shows some of the areas of the increased cancer risk, again, breast cancer in and around the site. Next. And we'll turn it over to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mary, before I hand it over, I had meant to try to introduce you, Dr. Dodge, but I couldn't find my unmute button. So let's give a Zoom round of applause to Dr. Robert Dodge. We're very grateful for him. He's been a long-term advocate for the cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Lab. And as an expert, he has really, not only has he done the work, but he's made himself available to the community for people like us who need experts on our side to prove that these aren't just stories we're coming up with. We're not hysterical women. We're real people, and Dr. Dodge helps bring the science to back up those claims and show that the site is a problem. So we're very, very grateful for him being here today. Mary Olson, which is spelled correctly on this slide. We're very, very, very grateful that she's here with us today. She's a very distinguished speaker. I'm going to let her give you a little bit of her background because it's extensive. But she has joined us today from the Gender and Radiation Impact Project. And she brings with her just incredible expertise that is especially relevant to our community. So let's go ahead and turn that over to you now, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I want to acknowledge that Melissa and I are meeting for the first time in this Zoom moment. So hi, Melissa. I hope we catch up sometime.
I agree. Denise was so excited that we were getting to work with you. She says a very warm hello.
Yes, wonderful. And Dr. Bob, we haven't seen each other in a long time, so it's lovely to share a Zoom moment with you as well. So thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you both for your tremendous contributions and leadership and compassion for a situation which is obviously very, very dire for so many people. And I want to acknowledge that I am learning tonight about your community and about this facility and about the challenges that you've been facing. I'm not coming from a long background of studying the Santa Susana situation, in part because I worked for Nuclear Information and Resource Service from 1991 to 2019, and we were a very small team. And knowing that someone as amazing a mind as Dan Hirsch and my coworker Diane Dorigo, when I was at Nuclear Information and Resource Service, were already focused in this whole development of understanding all these problems going back 20 years and longer. I had to do other things. They were already on the beat. So I'm not excusing myself and my ignorance, but I am telling you that I can talk to you about radiation and I can learn from you about what's happening in California, but I'm not bringing expertise on your site. Now, I want to just give a quick thumbnail, start my timer. It's late here, so I need to be responsible about time. Because I really want your questions and discussion. So I don't want to take all the time up with slides, besides which Dr. Bob already showed you some of it. But I want to start with the thumbnail of what my work brings forward. The first thing is that exposing children to ionizing radiation results in more harmful outcomes. And the only ones we have documented is cancer, but we do know that cancer is not the only outcome from radiation exposure. So using cancer as an indicator, exposing children results in more outcomes than adults for both males and females. But one of the biggest take-home lessons from the work I did is that we're not talking about childhood cancer only. As a matter of fact, we're talking primarily about higher risk across the entire lifespan for outcomes like cancer. So it's heartbreaking to see that there's a lot of childhood cancer in your community. It's also heartbreaking to realize that exposure of children in your community may place them at higher risk for their entire lives. This is not everybody in the studies that we look at from the A-bomb survivors, which is the data set that I've used, and we're going to walk through that in a minute. It is not 100%, like living on the site apparently is 9 out of 10. That's very, very scary. Nobody's actually sleeping there, I hope, but you know, that's scary. But the other big finding that I report, and we'll see in my version of the graph that Bob showed, in every age group of the A-bomb survivors, females suffered cancer as an outcome across 60 years more than males of the same age in every single age group. So female bodies in the lifespan study were harmed more than male bodies, and that's categorical. And this these two findings together about children being harmed more and female bodies being harmed more than males together really call into question the entire model of radiation regulation and the concept of dose and so many things that most of my time these days is focused on regulatory analysis and working towards regulatory reform. So I'm just going to give you that and have your understanding about why at age 65 I'm not getting on planes all the time like I used to. So I'm really glad to be here with you and to become a resource for you, but I live in North Carolina, far, far away, so it's going to be somewhat limited. So my website is genderandradiation.org, and the organization is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we do depend on support from individuals. So thank you very much for learning about the organization as well as me. Next slide. So this is not Fallout. I want to end by showing you the new Fallout map that just got published a week ago. But this is where nuclear detonations occurred. And your facility is tied up with the dawn of the nuclear era. And this is 2,000 and some detonations that have already happened on our planet. So we've kind of had the nuclear war without the destruction of the cities, which would be so much more terrible. But it does mean that we are dealing with a contaminated environment globally, not only in your community. Next slide. This is the same cover. We all talk about the Big Blue Report. So this thing has the actual tables of numbers. You can get it online for free. It's a download from the National Academy of Sciences as a big fat PDF. And that's what I did back in 2011 when I realized that the question that had come to me from a woman after a talk I gave on radioactive waste, she asked me, was radiation more harmful to her as a woman compared to a man? And I did not even have a notion of that question, let alone an answer that day in 2009. 2011, I saw reactors exploding in Japan and the question rushed back to me. And I really didn't want to go into the numbers in this report because they are the survivors of the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which my government chose to do with the second and third atomic bombs ever after having contaminated New Mexico with the first one. And to me, these are crimes. These are moral crimes. These are war crimes. These are terrible actions that I wish had never happened. And so to utilize the data is to participate in those, and especially because the study itself had many problems. I'm not going to take the time tonight to go into them, but they make it incumbent upon me to report that I am sharing with you data that really we shouldn't be using at all. However, it's the only large data set with a case control that has people of all ages and biological sexes, because these were cities full of people exposed by A bombs. So that's the source of the data, this big blue book. You can go look. Next slide. Okay, this is a peer review paper. I'm hoping these slides are made available to you so you can look that up. Next slide. All right, biological sex is a factor in ionizing radiation harm. This was not something I knew before I went to that book and did my own independent analysis. It turns out that the report itself says it 3 times in its 400 pages, but it doesn't offer you the pretty pictures I'm going to give you. And also there was a paper by Dr. Arjun Makajani and his team also in 2006 that is very parallel, predates mine. Mine is independent. So we like in science to have a second look and a second finding. So I encourage you to look up Arjun's work as well. And next slide. So you've heard that radiation damages genetic material. It damages DNA. Well, some of it can actually damage whole chromosomes. So radiation is invisible, but we can actually visually see the damage to these chromosomes. Next slide. Cancer is the only outcome that the federal government tracks as harm from radiation. We know that is not true, that cardiovascular outcomes are as common as cancer. We now have the data to back that up. And there's reproductive impacts, and there's immune impacts. There's a long list of various ways in which energy hitting our cells results in harm to us. I am going to be reporting here on cancer only, and I want to acknowledge that I'm going to be using it as an indicator rather than talking about the devastating consequences, but we all know that it is not a simple story. I'm simplifying it here because we're going to look at the outcomes. So the energy hits the cell. We have amazing capacity in our cells to repair damage to cells and to genetic material. But sometimes the repair is not perfect, or it can't be repaired. And when that's the case, then a damaged cell either dies and then there's no harm from it, or it sits in the tissue and waits. And it may be years or even decades before that damaged cell becomes part of a tumor, and the tumor becomes a cancer. About half of radiologically caused cancers are the cause of death, and about half are not the cause of death. They're simply an incidence rather than a fatal cancer. In general, the more radiation exposure we have, the more likely it is that we get cancer from that exposure. But cancer starts with a single cell, and therefore an exposure too small to measure can sometimes be the initiation of what becomes a fatal cancer, which is why we solidly say there is no safe dose. There is no safe exposure level to ionizing radiation, because all it takes is one radioactive emission and one cell, quoting Dr. Helen Caldicott there. So next slide. Radiation is more harmful to children. Honestly, there's been a literature about this for a long time. A bunch of radiation professionals tend to ignore it. But the people who survived the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were grouped according to the age they were in August 6th and August 9th, 1945. And those who had the greatest cancer outcomes were between the age of birth and 5 years old. And this is over a 60-year track that was published in the Beer 7 report in 2006. So from 1945 to 2006, there were 60 years tracked, and this group had the most cancer. And this is adjusted for age span and all those kinds of things in epidemiology to make it a fair comparison. Next slide. So there's huge news, and the huge news you saw on the graph from Dr. Dodge is that boys get cancer. Girls get twice as much cancer over the 60 years. This is cancer incidence, and we had no idea about this until the 2006 numbers came out, that it was this big a difference. And in biological research, a doubling, you stop, it's, stop the music, let's see what's going on. Next slide. So the EPA, in its infinite wisdom, thinks that we are dealing only with populations. They forget that we have a human life cycle, and that a little girl is integral to every other part of the human life cycle. So we can't pull them out. We're an inextricable link. Next slide. So I've already said this, basically, that we can no longer say that a dose is a dose is a dose, because it depends on who got it. And second, children are not a subpopulation, which is what the EPA thinks they are. Next slide. So there are gendered outcomes amongst the people who were adults in 1945. For every, this is now reporting fatalities because it's where the ratio is cleaner, for every 2 men who died of cancer in that 60 years of tracking, 3 women died of cancer. These are the people who were adults when they got the exposure. Next slide. Okay, here's my version of the same graph, same data set. This is adjusted for the idea, like a scenario. What if everybody got the same level of exposure? And the reason this is done is so you can look at age and biological sex more clearly and plot out the differences. So we're going to look at this. Okay, I hit my time, so I'm just going to whip through the next slides because they're important. Next slide. We'll come back to this graph again right here. because the green one is where this reference man guy is located. Every single regulation in the United States for radiation protection is based only on what's in that green circle. Whereas the people who are most impacted, the ones who were exposed when they were little girls, but then tracked for 60 years, is 7 times higher than that green circle. So there's clearly a lot of information that's not inside that green circle. And yet decision makers only see the 25 to 30-year-old male because that's the reference man. And they pretend like every exposure in the United States is only to reference men. Next slide. So I think we should be centering regulations on the little girl, not the adult male. Next slide. This is the definition of reference man. You can look it up. We can come back to it. It's from Arjun's website. Next slide. So they don't, I was going to say that decision makers see only this, but it's not true. They don't get the data about boys having a higher, if you expose somebody when he's a boy versus when he's an adult male, there's 5 times more cancer outcome. And that's not presented to the decision maker either. Next slide. And this is completely invisible. No information about females at all in the US decision-making structure. Next slide. Okay, we'll come back to this. We can go over the points of reference, girl. Next slide. We're almost there. Here we go. Radiation regulation based on reference man results in systematic underreporting of radiation harm for the global population and for your community. And so one thing you need to know as I wind up is that every standard that exists to quote unquote protect you is only protecting people in your community who answer to the reference man description, which is 5 foot 6 inches tall, 154 pounds, between the ages of 25 and 30, lives in an industrial lifestyle and habitat, meaning gets his food from the grocery store and has clean municipal water supply, works indoors, sleeps indoors, all those kinds of things. So only those people who fit into that very slim definition of a reference man are actually being quote unquote protected. So if we had a regulation that was based on what we know about little girls, reference men would be protected 7 times higher if we accorded any protection to the girls at all at the level of what's given today based on reference man. So reference girl is a great idea and I'm working on her and I invite anyone else to do so. It's not mine, it's ours. And with that, I'll stop. Yeah, we can come back. These are just sort of extra slides. Probably we want to come back to the pregnancy slide in the questions.
Okay, great. Everybody, let's give a Zoom round of applause for Mary. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna connect the dots. So we have a lot of new faces I saw on this Zoom, which is fantastic. A lot of the interest, I think, is because our community also is known to have a breast cancer cluster. And that has been talked about commonly, yet few people have talked about the Susana Field Lab. In fact, many people don't even know that it exists, even though most of us probably on this Zoom probably live within 10 miles of it. And considering that it is such a heavily contaminated site, that's significant, especially when we know the contamination is coming off site. So we saw how contaminated the site was with the site history. Dr. Dodge talked about how dangerous those contaminants at the site are to human health. And Mary spoke about how the dangers to women are higher and to our children. And that's why we're here, you know, because I live here, Jenny lives here, Dr. Dodge is not far from here. We are being exposed, and we know people. I already know a dozen people probably who either they've had cancer, breast cancer, bladder cancer, uterine cancer at young ages, friends whose husbands have had cancer at young ages, all under 40. It's not normal. And that's why we need to clean up the site completely. And as Mary was showing, that's why we need the background cleanup. We need all of the contamination gone. So we're going to talk a little bit about where the site is today. I'm going to go through it quickly because I know you guys probably have some burning questions. We want to be able to answer them. But part of this draw is to get you to understand, everyone here, that the site is dangerous, that it's not being cleaned up. And we need community groundswell in order to get things to change here. So, sorry, just blew right through those. So originally I'm going to go really quick. We have a whole series of other long town hall presentations, about an hour to hour and a half each, that go through each of these points in detail. So you can go through them there. I'm going to go through them quickly, but essentially in 2007, we had a very comprehensive cleanup agreement signed. It was well supported. It's still well supported by local government, our state government, our federal government, because it's going to clean up almost all of the contamination at the Santa Susana Field Lab. And you saw how Jenny showed the different parties own different parts of the Santa Susana Field Lab and are responsible for the cleanup. Well, this original cleanup is going to be covering Department of Energy, which is most of the radioactive work, and and NASA, which is a lot of chemical contamination. So this was signed for a cleanup to be completed by 2017. You'll notice it is not 2017, if you can see my watch. We are now in 2023, and the cleanup has not officially begun. The 2010 cleanup was even more comprehensive. I'm sorry, do you know what? I made a mistake. Now I can't even do my slides. 2007 applies to Boeing today, but they threw it out. We'll get there. It doesn't exist. They destroyed it recently, last year. The 2010 cleanup, that's what you were all thinking in your minds. That's what I was meaning to say, that this one applies to Department of Energy and NASA. So this was that famous background cleanup, meaning what seems really common sense, they would remove all of the man-made contamination, which is what I assumed all cleanups did. That's actually almost never the case. This was probably a precedent. This was probably going to make new cleanup standards across the nation. This would have been a very health protective cleanup because it would have taken away all the contamination, because at the Santa Susana Field Lab, our contamination isn't buried in vaults. It's not buried in big barrels. It's loose in the soil from all those accidents and spills and fires. And that makes it very mobile. So this would have taken all of that contamination away, so it couldn't reach our community. It was a huge, huge accomplishment. It was also supposed to be done by 2017. They blew past that deadline. And this cleanup has also been recently destroyed. So that's why we're trying to get this groundswell, because we are going to lose the cleanup. We are going to be, our lifespan for sure, we would be continually at risk of exposure daily because of the Santa Susana Field Lab. But not only that, like Dr. Dodge showed, that the kind of radiation that exists at the Santa Susana Field Lab and some of those forever chemicals, they can last for sometimes even up to 500,000, 500 million. Who's getting me a glass of wine after this? Because I'm telling you what, I need it. It's been a long day. A long time, generations. We're talking generations of people will be harmed if this contamination is left on site. That's why this matters. This new settlement agreement, which destroyed the 2007 agreement, you can see in this nice, clean little chart, it's going to leave, it's weakening the cleanup standards for 179 contaminants, and will actually leave 90 to 95% of the contamination permanently on site. These tactics, because they use some pretty darn deceptive tactics to make this cleanup changes. Pardon me, my dog just unplugged my charger. There we go. This will result in 90 to 95% of the contamination left on site. Reuters did a year-long investigative study. Their conclusions correlated with our technical expert, Dan Hirsch, at Committee to Bridge the Gap, to show that most of the contamination will be left on site. Also, Tevin Schmidt, who is a watershed scientist at the Wistoyo Shumash Foundation, says that the SSFL is polluting the surrounding watershed and groundwater And this is causing irreparable harm to sensitive plants, wildlife, and the residents. So we're on a fight, pretty much fight for our lives to protect our children from radiation, our women from radiation, and our men, of course, our whole community, all of our people, all the wildlife, because this isn't good for the wildlife, our water sources, and our environment. So where we stand now is pretty much bad. We're in a bad place, which is why we're reaching out. The 2003 Programmatic Environmental Impact Report, because the government loves acronyms, they call this the PEIR. It gets really confusing because we have so many acronyms and the data is just overwhelming. They broke that cleanup agreement from 2007 and 2010. And this is brand new. This only happened a few months ago. And instead of getting that really health protective cleanup, we're almost going to get zero cleanup. And they're acting like this is okay. They're acting like it's health protective. They're acting like we are unaware, or that we are able to, I don't know. They're acting like our lives don't matter, to be very frank. And we know that our community matters, our people matter, and we've got to fight to protect them. So DTSC has tried to convince our elected officials and legal counsel that we shouldn't sue over this document that's going to leave the contamination. But we know that if we don't take legal action now, we might not get to sue later. And then that means they could go forward with this terrible cleanup. We'll never get another chance. We've got to sue. And that's why we need you guys to learn more. So here's our lovely YouTube channel. Like and subscribe. I never thought I would say that out loud. To go and see all the information that we can. We've put online for you guys. You can also visit our website. And we want you to get involved. The pictures we saw earlier that Dr. Dodge showed of all of the children, those are all kids that I know personally. Kids from our community with cancer. I have their parents' permission to show those images. These aren't just abstract kids. These are our kids. And it's our community. And like Mary said, you can be exposed as a child and not get cancer for 40, 50 years. And we need to do everything we can to make sure our children and our community stay safe for the long term. We need you guys to reach out to your board of supervisors. We can email you this list of all the emails and a nice little sentence, a paragraph of what you can say. Because if they don't get involved now, we lose the cleanup forever. And it's a very scary proposition, knowing the risks that are to our community. Save the date. We've got our water to fight for as well. Not only do we have to fight for the cleanup of the soil, now we have to fight for the cleanup of the water. So this is going to be a really important date. We're going to have another town hall. We're going through all the documents now and tearing them apart. Once we come to our conclusions, we'll have another way to educate you guys with another town hall. So that way you guys can be informed and make your own choices about what's really happening, what risks you're willing to see happen in your community. And hopefully we'll stand unified and get some real change. Stay in touch with us. We do our best. I'm a very forgetful person, but we do our best to email everyone back. Don't use Facebook Messenger. That's the worst way to get a hold of me and Jenny. Is our email, our mailing list, and obviously a very big special thanks to Physicians and Social Responsibilities Los Angeles for Dr. Dodge and Gender and Radiation Impact Project for Mary Olson. And I hope that you would support these two incredibly important organizations. If you haven't seen the documentary, it's Emmy nominated last year. That's me right there and my daughter Grace. And the story follows me and several other families. And you can watch it right now. It's streaming on Peacock TV with a subscription. So with that, we are going to stop sharing. We have questions already. I love it. So I think what I'm going to do is not necessarily go in the order they were raised. We'll see. We've got some new people here who maybe I might give them a chance to ask some questions first. Some people have been here through several meetings and will want to ask questions. We're gonna try to give everybody a fair shot of asking some questions. So you can raise your Zoom hand under reactions. Yep, you can raise your physical hand. We'll try to get to you. And we're going to go through. I know, can I go first? I have a question. I have a question for Mary Olson. I noticed on your slide that said radiation and was more harmful to children birth through 5 years. And I am especially interested in that because of, my link to pediatric cancer. My daughter Grace is a 2-time cancer survivor of an incredibly rare and aggressive form of leukemia. She's 13 years old. She's been cancer-free for 5 years. The thing that's interesting, and I'm sure this isn't a surprise to you, is that childhood cancer, the age most common to get cancer is birth through 5 years old. You're probably aware of that. And I don't know if this is so much a question, but just a point of interest. It's also, I read a study by UC Berkeley that is also the age that children are eating the most dirt. They're very dirty little kids. My kids were always in the sandbox trying to shovel sand in their mouths as quick as I'm trying to get it out. And that's the age that children are rolling around on the ground. They're not washing their hands before they eat. They're very tactile. And so UC Berkeley had a theory that is part of the reason why children are more susceptible, also because they're at an age where they're having more contact. However, that doesn't explain the gender difference between boys and girls. So I
will be brief, but I want to start with a celebration that your daughter is 13. And I appreciate that you share that and that she's been standing with you as you work so hard for everybody's children. And this is huge. So I just want to bring in that, yes, eating dirt is certainly a characteristic of the youngest children that tends to go away over time. The other thing that we can say about the difference between males and females being greatest in this age group, the infant to 5 year and then still in the 5 to 10, is that this is the time when you wouldn't expect to see a lot of difference in diet, social behavior, smoking, occupational risks, all those things that go along with adulthood. And so the fact that the difference between males and females is in this very young group really does point to biological and physiological differences. And my work is a report that there is a difference. It doesn't say why. And nobody has yet been funded to conclusively take that question up. I don't get it, but that has not happened yet. So as you're going along and having conversations with people, you've got a lot of research institutions in California. Maybe someone has a brother-in-law or a sister or an aunt or whatever, somebody who's in the research world, just like pose it to them. They could get funding. There's a lot of women now in the funding world who would fund something like this, but it's got to be a good lab. So having said that, I'm going to add one more point and then we'll go on to the next question. This comes from Dr. Alice Stewart, who is the one who figured out that X-raying pregnant women resulted in a far higher rate of childhood cancer, was responsible for the outbreak of childhood leukemia in the UK back in the 1950s, because they got this great idea that you could monitor pregnancy with X-rays, and they were going to town with it. And she's the one who said, wait a second, that's what actually correlates to these childhood cancer outcomes. So Dr. Stewart's statement to me, I did get to meet her and I so honor my teachers, but she said to me that in her view, childhood cancer, it's not only, but it's largely a post-birth defect. So the exposure occurs either during pregnancy or to the ova before pregnancy, or spermatogonia or sperm, but they're so short-lived that it's probably not them. But it can be. So any of the reproductive cells are very, very vulnerable to radiation and can, if not so catastrophic to produce a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage, result in being seen in the children as cancer post-birth defect.
Which I'll just throw one tiny comment, because this is such an important issue to me, is that's what makes epidemiology very difficult, because they don't look at where the mother lived before. So with neuroblastoma, there's only 600 cases in the nation every year. I, off the top of my hand, can name 8 kids from our community that have had neuroblastoma, and those are just the ones that I know that went to treatment with my daughter. I think it was 8, but don't quote me on that kid. I'll get the real number for you if you need. We knew that one of the moms lived up in Bell Canyon, which literally shared a fence line with the Susana Field Lab. They built multi-million-dollar homes. She lived there when her daughter when she was pregnant with her daughter didn't develop cancer until she was 2.5, I believe, 3 years old. But epidemiology doesn't look at that. They don't look at where the mom lived. They don't look at who got cancer after moving away. They just look at that time stamp of exactly who lived, where they lived, when they got the cancer. And so it shows that this problem is probably much greater than even what the people tracking it are able to do with it. Anyhow, I just wanted to throw that out. And again, that's something that is a concern with this breast cancer data that Dr. Dodge showed, that from the breast cancer mapping project showed that our community is 10 to 20% higher than most of California. And again, that's probably even worse than that, because people who grew up here aren't being counted in that statistic if they get breast cancer if they're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. You know, they're getting only diagnosed, that the registry here, the California Cancer Registry, isn't looking at that.
So one thing I try to remember to say, and I failed till now, is that the lifespan study of A-bomb survivors reports only on the prompt radiation from the detonation of the bomb, which was gamma and neutron burst. And it doesn't include any fission products or any internal exposure, any fallout, any contaminated food or water, none of that. It's all external gamma neutron. And all of our regulations may have additional studies added on top, but they all say that it's based solely on external exposure, which is code language for we're basing this on the A-bomb survivors. So it also means that the findings that I told you about male versus female, children, adults, all of that, we don't really know whether those factors apply to contaminated food and water. We would want, with precaution, to assume that we should protect children and females better. But we don't actually have a source of data to support a gendered finding for contaminated food, water, and air. And we need it. And so it's more reasons to be gossiping and talking and getting the little wheels turning in the research community that this stuff really matters, because the whole world acts like radiation is a settled science. We know everything there is to know. And that is a lie, it is a cover story, and it's a myth. And we just have to bust through it and get some good research done. So I'll be quiet.
No, I agree. And I happen to know that there is a certain doctor/researcher here in this group who I'm glad he is part of this conversation, because he knows some people and he's a very brilliant man. I also want to point out too, to your point about not knowing everything, is that a friend of mine, Aaron Gatesman, is a researcher, and he found out that, for example, when the SRE melted down 1959, right, Jenny? Okay, good. I get my 40s and 50s mixed up. Don't ask me why. Anyhow, we had a huge release of radioactive iodine. Radioactive iodine has a very short half-life. And so a lot of people said, oh, there's not a huge problem. All these cancers are just coincidence. In fact, if you ask someone from the DTSC today, their official statement is contamination does not go off site of the Santa Susana Field Lab. And if it does, it's still not at a level to cause human harm. That's their official statement, which is just goes against common sense, let alone their own data and research and the studies. But Aaron found out, Dr. Aaron Gatesman found out that iodine actually gets stored in the fatty tissue. And so people who were exposed to the iodine were being internally radiated all this time. And his study was based off of 3 Mile Island release. But again, we can see that same kind of thing where we don't have the science, or the science is so new it's not being incorporated into these studies and into these regulations, where the amount of cancer are probably much, much bigger related to the Santa Susana Field Lab for people who were here during exposure. And also, we don't have a lot of research to show the damage being caused to DNA that can be inherited by the next generation, and how much that might make them susceptible. I mentioned that my mom grew up playing in the creeks and out here, and she was here for all the testing, and she was here right after the nuclear meltdown. And then I had an autoimmune disease that caused me to, it was a bleeding disease called ITP. And then when they went to treat me, I had 3 spleens. I had mutant spleens, and we all made a big joke about it. You know, how funny, what a coincidence. Nobody talked to this San Susana Field Lab. And then my daughter had an incredibly rare cancer. And it could be that we were all exposed. We've all lived within the Santa Susana Field Lab most of our lives, all 3 generations. But it also could be that the damage from the DNA going down the line may have caused more susceptibility. And so again, that's why we're talking about, not only is this a problem for our generation, that we need to make sure the cleanup happens, we need to make sure that we're cleaning it up for the future generations. Kit, I'm sorry that I ignored your hand. I will say real quick, we've gone past our time like we always seem to. You're welcome to jump off. I totally get it. Time to put the kids to bed, time to get a glass of wine, whatever you need to do. We're going to still be recording this. So if you'd like to stay on for more questions, then please feel free. So Kit, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. A couple of points. Since I'm reporting for an outlet that's quite a ways from Simi Valley, about 45 miles. You mentioned a couple of data points of contamination well beyond Simi Valley. One for Newberry Park, I guess from the wildfire smoke radiation study,
Yes,
and one. So yeah, that's very interesting to me. And Dr. Dodge also mentioned a study on, I think, breast cancer very quickly by. So I'm very interested in those 2 studies. If you could send me a clue and I will look them up. I'd appreciate that. And also last.
May I put in a disclaimer for that breast cancer study? It did not have, it did not look at causation. So that's a study that was done completely independent of the Santa Susana Field Lab. I just want to make that clear. But ironically, it shows exactly our site. Okay, cool. Keep going.
Okay, second question, and this is for you, Melissa. I just wonder, since you've been through this really harrowing experience over the course of life, do you have a theory on why Grace got her particular cancer? Do you have a particular idea about how that happened?
No, and I all I can say is that I learned about this. Like I said, I grew up 5 miles away on the other side of the hill in Falcon Oaks. We grew up hiking all the time. My family was very into camping, hiking. We were always outside, you know, on our bikes. My mom grew up here. So you would have thought that we would have known about the Santa Susana Field Lab if there was a family, you know, 3 generations in one place. We should have known. My mom thought it was urban legend, and that's again because there's so much good cover up was done on behalf of the scientists and the site owners. When Grace had cancer, and when I started to realize that there was something probably wrong in our community, and it's still one of the hard. There's not a lot that gets me to cry. You found my button.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's part of the healing process, right? I was the one who picked out this house in West Hills, and I didn't cause the SSFL. I didn't cause the contamination. I didn't even know about it when we bought the house. But there's still an amount of responsibility as a mom I felt for having picked a place that could have given Grace cancer. And so I don't know how she got it. I don't really have a theory. All I know is as a parent, it breaks you on a very deep level when you feel like, you know, you've pledged your life to protect your children, and then in some small part of that puzzle, you were part of it. It's a very painful thing. I don't know if it would bring me peace if I knew exactly how she got it. I do know that what is not fair about DTSC, which by the way is the Department of Toxic Substance Control, and just in general, the culture in America right now is very much started by the tobacco industry, where they didn't want people to sue the tobacco industry. So they hired rogue scientists with fake science and all this. And we're now living through that culture of science being harder to trust. Where was I going with that? That they want us to be lab rats. They say that we can't prove that the Santa Susana Field Lab caused any of these cancers because we don't know. I think I've said this before. We don't know the dosage. We don't know the exact contaminant. We don't know you know, the exposure time and, you know, but we're not lab rats. We're not, this isn't petri dish science. We're real people. And so we shouldn't have to prove, I loved that quote by Cindy, that we shouldn't have to prove that this is causing all the cancers. I mean, we already know that the cancers are above average because we have very reputable, federally funded independent studies that show it. But as Mary said, this isn't just cancer. We know, I mean, throw a stone and someone has a thyroid disorder out here. You know, autoimmune diseases are rampant out here. There's a lot of severe allergies where kids can only eat 2 foods without getting massively sick. You know, it's the developmental issues, autism is very high out here, but the studies don't exist to show that as much. And so they put the burden of proof on the people, and the people are the ones who've mostly suffered from it. We're the least equipped and resourced to fight back. And yet we're the ones who have to do it because the government isn't. I will say that not president, oh my gosh, that was a faux pas. Governor Newsom is running for president, they think. And, you know, Boeing can donate a lot of money to that. Boeing knows a lot of people and can make that happen. And so there's a lot of investment for Boeing not to get upset by the Susana Field Lab and for our governor to push through this false claim. Again, I'm kind of losing my track. I'm ranting, so I'm going to give it back to Ginny, who looks like she knows what she's talking about, and then we'll go to Mary. But
No,
Kit,
I just wanted, because I don't know how much time she has. I just wanted Mary to be able to.
Mary, this is why I love Ginny. We're such a good team.
Melissa, I support you and everything that you have said. And so please understand that I'm simply trying to also give context. Cancer is one of those things that at this current rate of knowledge that we have, it's like extraordinarily rare for an expert or a physician to be able to stand up and say, this person with this particular cancer got it because of X, Y, or Z thing. We don't have, what shall we say, the footprint identified at that level. Now, you can get really close in some situations. And so I'm not dismissing that. But in general, you can say, however, that a site that has a lot of radioactivity that is leaving the site and exposing people is certainly creating cancer from those exposures. But you just can't prove exactly which cancer, right? So I want to just go back to that. We keep showing that cover of Beer 7, which is Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, 7th report in a series published by the National Academy of Sciences with a panel of very esteemed experts who put that thing together. Well, it's got a lot of problems, and we've spent years criticizing it. But at the same time, we show it and we bring it out because, as Dr. Dodge said, it's the basis for the linear no threshold, that there is no safe level. Every amount of radiation carries the possibility of causing harm and disease. But it's also a darn blue book, like the old used car thing, right? And you can point to that big fat blue report and say radiation causes cancer. That is the document that makes that statement absolutely defensible. And so it's absolutely Cindy's quote and my quote also that it's not incumbent upon victims to prove causation. First, you can't prove causation. Second, these things cause cancer. These things are in your community. Therefore, this site is causing cancer in your community. Full stop. Now, can you, again, go back and litigate on specific cancers? Probably not. But I really, really encourage everybody to contribute to whoever's doing the legal work, because you cannot come back later in our legal system and say, oh, now I want to sue. You have to go every single round at every single level, every single time to retain what's called standing. So even if you lose, it doesn't matter, because you need to keep showing up and filing the things on time, meeting the deadlines, and retaining the standing of your community And the way the legal system goes, you win some, you lose some. But unless you do every single round, you're out of the next round. And so I just really want to reinforce for people that there is no, oh, we'll do it later. Because you come back later and they're going to say you don't have standing.
Thank you for that.
So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you.
And then one last little framing comment, and I'll keep it brief, but women, when they have children, if their children have children, are grandmothers. And the outcomes, health outcomes of the grandchildren can truly date back to an exposure of their grandmother directly, not only through heritable genes, that's one way, but directly, because if there is a female fetus, her ova are formed while she is in her mother, who is then the grandmother of those eventual grandchildren that come out of those ova. So the ova are present in the pregnancy of a female fetus in the woman who will then be the grandmother. So if we have any thought about why we need to protect ourselves and each other, it's that we are grandmothers, or we will be grandmothers. And we have to, we can't, it's not another day. The standing issue is there too.
Jenny?
I'm not going to go on long, I promise. But when Mary Olson said that, you know, now is the time to enter litigation because you need to keep standing, we will do a future town hall about this. But the other reason why it's so important that we reach out to the Board of Supervisors and City of Los Angeles, City of Simi Valley, is because what DTSC would like to do is tell people there is no danger. Now is not the time to sue over the recently released documents. And what they want to do is release them in small batches over the next several years. And neither county and none of the cities are going to have that amount of money to be able to do multiple suits. So I just want you to keep in mind when we do our action alerts that this is the time, because the litigation probably won't be funded in the future to attack these issues piecemeal. So I just want to, Mary, you inspired me to put an extra little push in there. So soon we will be asking you to, you know, virtually attend public meetings, to send letters. We'll try to make it as easy as we possibly can, but we hope that you all participate. Thank you.
And I hope you get a really good National Environmental Policy Act attorney, because that's called segmentation, and it's not, it isn't okay.
And then help spread the word. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Let's give another round of applause for our special guests today, Dr. Dodge and Mary Olson. We're very grateful for your time. We know how busy you are and the important work that you're doing. The fact that you would share your incredibly valuable time with us today is just very meaningful and appreciated. And it's going to get me to cry again. Oh my gosh. We really do appreciate you guys. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. We'll talk again soon. Good night.